Henry from Tupelo, Mississippi, suspiciously with a W on the end, he said yesterday was really hyped in storm circles. Do you think it was a bust? Or did you see anything worth talking about? This is a massive debate right now in the weather community. Was yesterday a bust or not? So for those of you unfamiliar, yesterday was supposed to be historic and explosive, and in many ways it was. I don't make light of this. There were dozens of fatalities in the South and the Mid-South even, and portions of the Midwest over the past 2 days because of violent storms and tornadoes and flooding, wildfire. So it was a very robust storm system that moved across the country. And then afterwards, if you get anything less than an all-time historic outbreak of tornadoes, once the Storms Prediction Center has said, hey, it's coming, the big one's coming, then you have people say, oh, this was a bust. Oh, they missed this forecast. It wasn't a big deal. My take on this, since I was out in the field all day yesterday chasing storms, and I'll tell you about that in a second, is you have to have a two-pronged approach on this. One of them is emotion and public, and the other is science and private. Because I want you to think about this. Let's say you're just in Plantersville, Alabama, which I know got hit hard yesterday. If you lost your home, if you lost a loved one, your entire life just got turned upside down. Can you imagine the discourse that you hear centering around how big a bust the forecast was and how not a big deal this was in the grand scheme of things? Well, your house is strewn across a greater part of the zip code, or worse. That was the worst day of your life. So it was catastrophic in your eyes. So publicly, when you talk about this stuff, to answer the question, no, it wasn't a bust. Because if anyone lost property or had a property damaged or lost a loved one, it was terrible. But absolutely, as a scientist, if you work at the National Weather Service and the Storms Prediction Center, I know several of those guys. One of the first things I did when I went to Norman, Oklahoma this past year was, hey, I can't wait for this Oklahoma football game, but I'm also going to be here Friday. Can I come over? And I went over and met with all those guys. They got to get behind closed doors, and they got to take an emotionless look at what our forecast was. Did it verify? If it didn't, what were the factors? You have to quality control yourself. No different than if you work at a news station or you sell insurance. You got to look at your approach, and then you go attack it, and then you get feedback, and then you adjust. It was a big day. I was out all day yesterday. I drove 1,060 miles yesterday from sunup to way past sundown. I got back to Nashville before midnight, though. I started in Columbus, Georgia. 6 a.m. I set out. I went all the way up to Tuscaloosa, met up with some people. We ended up driving all the way down to Hattiesburg, Mississippi. We went all over South Mississippi. They got torn up. Prayers for a lot of you guys down there. I know you need it. I know it's going to be a long cleanup. We were in Bassfield. Two very close calls in Bassfield yesterday, Summerall, Mississippi, Heidelberg, Laurel. So we were all around southern Mississippi. We ended up going all the way back up to Meridian, over into Demopolis, Alabama, back up to Tuscaloosa, over to Birmingham, back to Nashville. Did that all yesterday, over 1,000 miles. Everything was rain-wrapped. It was really hard to see. We kind of sort of low-key got ourselves in a little bit of a trouble for just a second there near Heidelberg yesterday, but got out. But it was a wild time. Those picturesque, long-track wedge tornadoes that I really thought were going to be a staple of yesterday, those weren't provided in abundance, which is a very good thing. It's not a bad thing. So what my expectations were, they probably weren't quite met, which, again, is a very good thing. I can't emphasize that enough. But, yeah, it was active now. Hey, quick timeout. Check and see if you're subscribed to the channel. If you're not, make sure you do. It's free. It doesn't obligate you or sign you up for anything. It just helps us keep the channel free. All right, back to the show. It was rough. It was active. But I don't have a ton of video to show you to answer several questions we got. Not a ton of like photogenic moments from yesterday. It's just rain-wrapped tornadoes. That's what we were dealing with yesterday. I got into it. I saw several people ask, before I move on here, because it's a college football show, I saw many people ask a question about this. I did want to address it. Friday, some of you saw that I had a little interaction back and forth. It wasn't pleasant. It was with someone who just kind of called out the way I talk about weather. I am very passionate about atmospheric science. I'm a huge weather nerd. I've loved it my whole life. Storm chasing is my other biggest hobby. And this was a person who I have since spoken privately with. We hashed it all out. It's fine. But they had an opinion, they expressed it with me, and this is a person who has suffered loss in the past due to severe weather. So when they look at someone glorify or celebrate chasing storms, chasing tornadoes, they got a problem with it. So I listened to it, took it to heart, offered my perspective, but a lot of you asked about that. Like, what was the deal with that? It was just two people viewing things two different ways. Both had their reasons. Handled it privately. We're good now. But I mean, I wasn't going to air that out on the show. I'm still not going to air that out on the show. But there's an understanding. It circles back to what we were just talking about there. There's a delicate way you have to deal with this. I mean, there's no thrill to me like seeing a tornado. Ideally, you always see them chewing up a wide open cornfield in Nebraska, and outside of maybe loss of crops, fingers crossed, insured, no one gets hurt. That's an ideal world. This is no fairy tale world, so oftentimes you can't have one without having the downside, which is property loss and sometimes worse. I've always looked at it as me rooting for it or not is not going to change whether it happens or not. So as long as it's going to happen, number one, since I'm very passionate about it, it just boggles your mind when you can witness that stuff live. I want to go experience it, and I accept the risk. But also, just so you understand, our primary objective out there is visualizing and then gathering. If you're in the data gathering field, you may run a YouTube channel, whatever your main goal out there is. The secondary goal for everyone is you better be equipped and ready to help the moment search and rescue time sets in. Everyone I know who chases has participated in it. You've got stories that I wouldn't tell on air. I've got my own. I wouldn't tell them on air. You see some terrible things, but you know if that's going to happen. That's the trade-off. You want to be out there, you want to thrill seek, that's fine. But you also got to be ready to put yourself in position to help. So that's kind of part of the package there. Just so everyone understands that. Anyone who gets into that field, that's something you need to accept as being part of your role.